hosted through our Racial Justice Tech Policy gift from the Kapor family. We are honored to have the gift from Frida Kapor-Klein and Mitch Kapor, particularly as it honors the ability for Heller to be a part of the movement to increasingly close the equity gap, which is also the wonderful name of the Kapor-Klein's book of the same title, Creating Wealth and Fostering Justice in Startup Investing. In particular, their focus throughout the book is to describe that they want to invest in groups that are actively working to close the gap in terms of access to information or goods and services, particularly in the space of AI, generative AI and tech. And that is the wonderful work of our Racial Justice Tech Policy Program, led by our program director, Ezra Tefera, who brings together scholars from across the world to co-create capacity, innovate on research and lab ideas, as well as come up with knowledge production, in other words, education. So we're honored to be hosting this event, particularly through the wonderful gift of the Kapors. I also want to pivot and say we're extremely excited today because we are able to honor the building that many of us are in right now, the Heller Building. Particularly at this time in Heller's history, this is the 65th anniversary of the Heller School, and its founder was Florence G. Heller, who was a philanthropist and a community and national organization leader. I'm going to read a lot about her because she actually deserves much more time than we'll be giving her right now. But in 1959, 65 years ago, she founded and endowed the Heller Graduate School in Advanced Studies in Social Welfare here at Brandeis. At the time, the Heller School offered a doctoral program in social policy, administration, and research, and a master's in the management of human services. Both programs provided training in aging, health policy, income maintenance, which is a term I'd never heard before, and social services. Florence Heller was born in 1987 in Albuquerque, part of the New Mexico Territory, and by 1917, she settled in Chicago. Her work with the Red Cross during World War I led her to the Jewish People's Institute, from which developed the Jewish Community Centers of Chicago. After 17 years as president of its Women's Auxiliary, she served 16 years as vice president of the National Jewish Welfare Board and became its first woman president in 1964. For many years, she was the board's representative of the Conference Group of Non-Governmental Organizations of the United Nations. And then Florence was instrumental in establishing the United States Organizations, or USO. From 1941 to 1946, she served as chairman of the management committee of the Central USO Club of Greater Chicago. She was also a member of its National Board of Governors and its Chicago Council. Florence G. Heller was deeply involved in a range of social impact initiatives, serving as vice chairman of the National Women's Division, United Jewish Appeal, representative of the National Jewish Welfare Board, as chairman of its Sixth Service Command, Armed Forces, and Veteran Service Committee, and she was a board member of the World Federation of Youth Men's Hebrew Associations, the Jewish Foundation of Metropolitan Chicago, the Sinai Temple of Chicago, and so much more. When she passed away in 1966, Brandeis University and its Florence G. Heller Graduate School was one of her principal beneficiaries. In 2019, Dean David Weil announced the creation of the Florence G. Heller Chair. This endowed chair recognizes the importance of the practitioner scholar who conducts field-based research and brings those teachings into the classroom. The chair is partially funded by the Florence G. Heller Endowment. Susan Kernan, former director of the Center for Youth and Communities and associate professor of the practice, was the first chair holder. When Susan transitioned to an associate research professor role, she stepped down last summer from her role as the Florence G. Heller Associate Professor of the practice. I was pleased to be able to honor our extraordinary colleague, Joel Cutcher-Gershenfeld, as the new Florence G. Heller Professor. Joel, your appointment comes in recognition of your outstanding accomplishments in transforming labor management relations, bridging digital divides in underserved communities, in forging agile and adaptive social institutions. Your work clearly demonstrates how academic knowledge and insight can combine with practice to have a positive social impact. Your efforts to incorporate field-based learnings into your teaching prepares Heller students for even greater success as they take on world challenges. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you as our inaugural RJTP lecturer today, as well as appointing you to the role of the Florence G. Heller Chair. Congratulations.
Thank you, Maria. And by the way, I think we should put the slides up. Yes. I will say that I have cousins in the Chicago area, and will tell you that who are involved in Jewish community activities, and they say Florence Heller is still remembered as a force of nature in the Chicago area. So it's truly an honor to carry that title of the Florence G. Heller Chair, and it's an honor and a delight to be here. In honor of that, what I'd like to do is to take you all on a journey into institutional agility at a time of accelerating technological change. And this is my way of, in a sense, inaugurating the chair, and it's very much in the spirit of theory and practice. To begin with, and by the way, we have quite a few folks online, just as a heads up for those of you who are online. About halfway through, you'll be in breakout groups having a discussion. So I don't want it to be a cold call, but that will be happening soon. Actually, I'd like to begin with a story. In 2018, a small group of about a dozen representatives of historically Black colleges gathered in a workshop in Atlanta, in which they had just finished a small NSF grant on research computing and data. And the idea was that with better computing and data capabilities, what the NSF calls cyber infrastructure, they could not just catch up to PWIs, predominantly white institutions, but could in a sense leapfrog and study and work on things that were unique to their voice, their identity, their interest. So that was put out to the group coming off of this small grant that they might expand the efforts. And actually, I think a couple of people online who were in that room at the time. And I remember two comments that will stand out. One was a fellow from Maryland Eastern Shore University who said, "You're talking about high performance computing, and I'll tell you, I don't have two sticks to rub together. You know, we have basic digital divide challenges." The second was another person who said, "You have to understand, HBCUs all love each other, but we compete with each other incredibly. We compete on the sports field, we compete for students, we compete for funding. If you don't understand the competition side of this, you don't understand what you're trying to do." And in fact, as a result of that meeting, we did a very small stakeholder map of about 20 some HBCUs, which showed that there was clear interest in building out data and computing capabilities. But it involved acknowledging and addressing the competitive side as well. And so after some deep dialogue, they formed what's called MSCC, the Minority Serving Cyber Infrastructure Consortium, which continues to function today. It's had major NSF and other funding that has come in. It's a going concern. And I tell this story really for two reasons. One, that they were accomplishing together what they couldn't do separately and actually creating a new institutional arrangement that would enable them to do that. But second, it happened not in spite of, but because of the appreciation for the competing interest as well as the common interest. And that's going to be a theme throughout this talk. So what I'd like to do is start, as I'm sure all of the seminars in this room always start, which is with France in the 1400s. This is a tapestry from the middle 1400s in France. And The reason I put it up here is that you can see it has the monarchy, it has the military, there's a church in the far background. It turns out it was around the middle 1400s that the word institution first appeared in a Western language, French. There is a Sanskrit word that precedes it, but what's interesting to me about this image is these arrangements, monarchies, militaries, had been around for 500 to 1,000 years before they even had a word. It was like the water to a fish. They were just taken for granted as part of the world in which they lived. If we fast forward, this is a picture of the shop floor of the Auburn Motor Company. And I know people online won't be able to speak up right away, but I'm willing to bet that very few of you have ever heard of Auburn Motors. It turns out if you drive through Indiana, that factory is still there in the town of Auburn, Indiana. And at the time of this picture, which was more than a century ago, at the turn of the last century, Auburn was one of 140 car companies just in the state of Indiana. Almost anybody who was making carriages was trying to put an engine in it. And the reason I put this here, notwithstanding that they didn't quite get Henry Ford's idea of an assembly line, they were moving their axles from sawhorse to sawhorse. But the reason I put it here is at the time of this picture, institutional arrangements like constitutional monarchies, boys' clubs, girls' clubs, all sorts of arrangements came into existence in the space of 50 to 100 years, rather than 500 to 1,000. The whole field of social work and Hull House really was in the space of one lifetime became a field. And so the pace of change at the institutional level of society had moved faster by an order of magnitude. Now, if we fast forward, starting with Peoria and Sable's book in 1984, there's a series of books that I have pictured here, which are just some of the ones that argue that we're in a post-industrial digital age, a discontinuous shift. The book on the far right was one that I wrote with my brothers on this. And I mean, we can go into detail about each of these different shifts, but what they all have in common is a further acceleration of the pace of change. Major changes in our society documented in this are really happening in the space of 5 to 10 years within a lifetime, an order of magnitude faster as well. And that's really the spirit of this talk today, which is that changes, not just technological, also social, are happening at an accelerating pace. And the question is, how do institutions respond? How do institutions co-evolve? And so when we talk about technological change, this is a picture from the 1950s of what they imagined the babysitter of the future might look like. And of course, we know how it really turned out. And of course, the point is that with change of this sort, it will have a logic to it, but won't always be the logic of the past. And with that in mind, what I'd like to do is to anchor the journey that we're about to take with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to do a deep dive on Goal 9 and Goal 13. We're going to look at a stakeholder mapping data and some analysis that is on those two. Although I will say, this obviously speaks to my favorite two goals, 16 and 17, which is all about strong institutions and partnerships for the future. And so essentially, we're going to get our arms around how do you have institutional change to advance goals of broad societal importance at a time of accelerating change. In order to get to that, first I want to define what we mean by institutions. Elinor Ostrom called them the rules that we actually use, not just aspirational statements, that produce outcomes and affect folks, if you will, in an ecosystem. Douglas North called these the humanly devised constraints in society, political, economic, and social. Essentially, institutions are the rules of the game. And the thing that I want to say about that is that institutions aren't just static rules. They are repeated actions that get codified in here's how we do it. And as Anthony Giddens argued, this process of structuration is an ongoing process. Institutions are not static. And as the patterns change, the institutions themselves are the product of those patterns. They change. In my own writing, I argued in an article with an amazing fellow, Joe Isaacs, who we wrote this article when he was in his mid-90s. And he had personally lived over 70 years of Australian industrial relations rulemaking. And we were able to sit down and look at 100 years of institutional arrangements. And what we found is you could very easily classify them as new laws, rules, provisions designed to either create value or mitigate harm. Some did both, but in most cases, it was mitigating harm. There was a problem and people said government should do something about it. In some cases, though there were clear initiatives, I was involved in a move starting about 10 years ago for Australian labor relations to promote what they called cooperative and productive relations. So it was more about creating value. And so we're going to use that lens in a little bit as we look at this. But we're also going to use the lens from an article that we published, myself and a whole group of colleagues in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, arguing that multi-stakeholder consortia have the ability to be agile when institutions and more stable arrangements cannot do so. And that's the theme we're going to come back to. So this is the sort of model that we've been working on. We have an article forthcoming on institutional change. And basically, to read this model, you start on the left with, I'm sorry, on the right, but looking at this, I guess it's your left, with the existing institutional arrangements. And invariably over time, there's points of alignment and misalignment. And in response, there's a series of initiatives, consortia and others, that try to create guardrails where you're trying to mitigate harm or promote value add in one way or another. And part of doing that is even saying who are the stakeholders and what are the interests. And I'm going to show you today some ways to think about that. We'll touch on the other elements of the model as well. But invariably, power comes in, there's supporting and opposing forces. And out of that emerge proto-arrangements like this minority-serving cyber infrastructure consortium. And as those patterns repeat, remember institutions are the product of repeated patterns, they start to, they become part of social dialogue, what the Europeans call, rulemaking happens, learning and adjusting happens, and eventually they are the existing institutional arrangements. And so there's a cycle that's always in motion in this context. And we're going to now apply it into two areas that I promised as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to spend about 5 to 7 minutes on AI ethics, and then we'll do a little discussion. And then we'll spend another 5 to 7 minutes on geoengineering and the climate. And I just picked two of them, but they're two in which I had the honor of doing some considerable work. So in the case of AI ethics, I worked with the American Geophysical Union and NASA, which were interested in coming up with guidelines for AI in geoscience research. But the real subtext was that as a federal agency, for NASA to do something around AI would involve a rulemaking process that is complex and long. And so they really wanted the AGU to come up with some recommendations on this to get the conversation started. As part of it, we did a very focused stakeholder map. We identified 118 people who were thought leaders in this area. The survey was distributed mostly through professional societies, but some others joined in. And people could have more than one identity in responding, but the majority of folks, the large majority, over 3/4, were folks who either were using AI, but were knowledgeable or professionals in this area. So what did they tell us? Well, first of all, I've done at least 24 stakeholder mapping surveys in the last 10 years, and I've never seen one that was as much of a lightning rod as this. Actually, I'm sorry, this was bad, but the geoscience one you're going to see was even more of a lightning rod. But in this case, people said that we should think of AI and machine learning as not replacing humans. They're raising the question, who possesses knowledge when AI generates it? They're asking how to build on the success, but also to make sure that the approach is inclusive. Industry is happening much faster than government, and that is a dangerous issue. Deeply concerned about vulnerable populations, and solving AI ethics before it's too late are just some of the comments that we heard. What I'm going to share with you now is what we call a Z-flower. This was something that was generated with National Science Foundation funding about 10 years ago. And essentially, what we were looking for was a way to visually demonstrate alignment and misalignment among stakeholders in complex systems. And what you see here is a method in which every respondent, to a survey, every stakeholder is assigned a color-coded hexagon. And then we tile them starting in the middle with the mean, above and below the mean. So the center of one of these hexagon shapes, which we call a Z-flower, since we sometimes use Z-scores in generating them, is the mean. And then the outliers are literally on the outside. So it's a way of seeing the entire distribution of responses in one quick visual thumbprint. And what we find is that when people see these, they instantly respond in a visceral way, different than if you just presented means and standard deviations or even a bar chart. So in this case, here's the Z-flowers for two questions. One was, how important, by the way, we do this, we always say how important and how difficult it is, because almost everything is important, although you'll see one thing here is not. But the gap between importance and difficulty tells you if is this low-hanging fruit or is this going to be a big hill to climb. And if you look at the Z-flower on the left, we said how important is to have clear ethical standards and guidelines for AI. And virtually everybody, 95% of the folks answered 7 to 10 on a 10-point scale on importance. So it's either important, very important, or very important. There's a few folks that are outliers that say they don't know or it's not. But the vast majority of folks, if you were a leader here, you could be with confidence say, subject matter experts are saying this is important. But notice that 68% of the folks say it's hard or very hard to do. So this is going to be one of those heavy lifts. Now, we did say, because we held a series of focus groups before we developed the standards that you'll soon see. And to be fair on the survey, I thought, some people said we don't need standards. Scientists are already guided by ethics. And so I thought we should ask the question the other way, do we not need ethical standards? And as you can see, only 18% of the respondents said that would be important. The vast majority said no. And so clearly, anybody who is arguing we don't need standards, there's clear evidence that that's not something that's supported. And people were all over the map on how difficult it would be to do nothing, which is understandable. But then we asked, is AI and ML, is it important to understand how it's changing the power dynamics in society? And what's interesting to me is most people said it was important. Some didn't know. Those are the blank squares. But then when we said how difficult is it, I wouldn't say it's fully bimodal, but there's a substantial group of folks that said it's not that difficult and others that said it's very difficult. And so that means that as you go into the power issues around AI and ML, you're going to immediately encounter some folks that are on both sides of that question, which suggests two very different kinds of conversations. And in terms of developing the tools and methods to audit AI for the results of potential biases, again, almost everybody is saying it's important, but the vast majority of people are saying it's really, really hard to do. And so we do these as discussion starters for people to then lean in and have conversations. And I'll say more about that in a minute when we talk about the geosciences. But based on both the survey work and the focus groups, we came up with a series of 6 principles, which have now been published in Nature about a month ago. And essentially we argued that it's important to build transparency, to have intentionality that's explained, to mitigate risk, to do so in a participatory way, to provide outreach training and documentation of leading practices, and for it to be an ongoing sustained effort. Now, even though in the article we were able to point to examples of each of these, it's very clear that these are easier said than done. And so, in a sense, if we were to think about institutions, each of these is a challenge. And if you think back to mitigating harm and creating value, the challenges of AI are deeply embedded on both sides of that conversation. So it's with that in mind that I'd actually like to have a small exercise, though there's a few people in the room here, so it'll be a small group discussion among groups of 2 or 3 of you here. And online, Ezra, how many folks do we have online?
Yeah, 42.
42. Will be Ezra, who's the brains behind today's Zoom call, as well as the logistics and the programming for this important initiative. Ezra will be sending you in a few minutes into separate breakout rooms of about 3 or 4 people each. But some of you know that, of course, most of you, I'm sure, that the Screen Actors Guild went on strike last year. And but most people don't know about the settlement. And so what I'd like to do is just share you a little bit of how they're dealing with AI. And then in the discussion groups, I'd like you to at least start the conversation about the institutional implications of what you see here. And then we'll unpack that in a couple of ways. And by the way, when you think about institutional implications, it begins with who are the stakeholders and what are the interests? And then what might be the repeated patterns that are part of what could be emerging institutional arrangements. So the agreement says that if you are working on a film, that's the employment-based digital replica, and they make an image of you that they use in another scene that you didn't act in, there has to be consent and compensation for doing that. It also says that if you use your image in another film for which you were not a performer, there has to be consent and cooperation. And if they independently create a digital replica of you, where you weren't even part of a prior property, that you have to have consent and compensation. And if they alter you digitally, you have to have consent and compensation. They also said, and this is something that's still a puzzle to me, if they create synthetic performers that never existed, there has to be consent and cooperation. I'm told, this is now 30 years ago, when in Japan they were first automating parts of auto operations, the unions negotiated that every worker who was replaced, the robot would have to pay the equivalent dues to the union. And so here we have synthetic performers. Is it the programmer that needs to give consent? Or there's interesting questions there. They did call correctly for semi-annual meetings of the union and producer. Think again, repeated patterns, what does that mean? But what the Europeans call social dialogue certainly would be happening there. They also, by the way, said if there's digital replication and alteration of background actors, there needs to be consent and compensation. And if they create background actors as digital replicas, again, consent and cooperation, although it's not clear how that happens. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is to just have at most 5 minutes of, or 7 maybe, in a breakout room, and there might be 2 or 3 groups here, or maybe just a group of the whole, to just start the conversation on, put on your digital, your institutional change hats. What are the things that will be unfolding in society that we need to think about, just given this one agreement that's trying to wrestle with the implications of AI. So as we're going to open up the breakout rooms, and again, when you get to the breakout rooms, introduce yourself quickly. I apologize in advance. You'll be someone will be in the middle of a sentence and you'll be cut off and brought back to the main room. But this is a chance to sort of take this idea of institutions being agile in the face of technological change and think it through in one specific case. Go for it. And here, maybe we'll just do this as a whole room. What are your thoughts? Yeah.
So Joel, maybe I get started. So as you know, as I was unfamiliar with, you know, the extent of the details on the settlement that you walked us through. And as you went through it, I kept thinking, well, how do you verify any of this?
Yes.
I mean, if you're supposed to be compensated for all those different things, and what are you just spending all your time looking around? I mean, how do you know? Do you have to trust that they're going to actually, you know, do this compensation? Because certainly in terms of the incentives, it's.
Yeah, we were recently at a dinner gathering, and there's a fellow who's an angel investor, and we were talking about another topic, but it's on point. He said, when someone reaches over and grabs you by the shoulder and says, trust me, I've got you on this, it means you're screwed, right?
Right, exactly.
So you're right. How do you implement and verify is a huge issue with any of this. It will take entire institutional arrangements for monitoring and implementing.
Would you say on that subject that you simply create a penalty arrangement that will disincentivize people not to follow those rules?
So that's an interesting question. Should this be compensation with a carrot, or should this be penalties with a stick? But it gets back to the monitoring.
To the person who needs to be compensated, but people who try to avoid compensating.
Right.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's not just monitoring, but enforcement.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, we don't have a good track record in this country, you know, sort of thinking about, you know, actually, it requires the person to actually report.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still this issue of how you find out. So if you think about the administration of wage and hour laws, I mean, the onus, or OSHA, the onus usually falls on the person who was aggrieved to file the case. There's not an automatic process in place to flag.
I understand, but because this person's image or characteristics are displayed outside, the very fact that they are out in the open should enable the person to know that his image or.
Although, as Lisa said, does that mean they have to watch every film that's produced? And Maria?
Yeah, how do you quantify the penalty or the harm?
Yeah.
How do they define?
How much compensation
How much
for what
compensation?
kind of alteration?
The whole point is to make the penalty so severe that you don't have the incentive.
Except for what's happening is how pervasive this will become, and it is already happening, that it becomes more the norm and not something you could collect penalties on. So it makes sense. There's a tipping point for how this is already happening in the political sphere, especially. It's so rampant that there will be no way to.
So there really is no way of saying, how do we even measure what compensation, what harm, what benefit is involved in order to come up with any kind of fair way of enforcing or enacting that.
Especially when it's so pervasive. It will be so pervasive.
Let me push it a little further. I met with Jody Hoffer-Gattel's doctoral group and put this in front of them. What I had them do, and I'm going to ask this in a minute, is a stakeholder map. Who are the stakeholders that would be affected by this language? They, of course, said, obviously, the actors, the studios, the producers, the crews on set. But then we pushed it because I said, let's come up with more than 10 stakeholders. And as the conversation unfolded, it actually became quite interesting. One of the stakeholders that a student mentioned is People Magazine, because they depend on people being interested in the stars and their personal lives and what have you. But what if increasingly the stars are AI generated? Is there a market for the personal lives of the AI characters?
Well, and the stakeholders, one could say, are consumers, which
Absolutely.
end up being 8 billion people.
Yeah, how do you feel about watching films that were, if you knew that that wasn't really the person, that was a digitally generated version of that person?
And what impacts does that have on people's body image when people on screen are literally not even human bodies?
Yeah, so this could further accelerate body image issues because in creating the images, they might say, well, we'll modify it a little and take out this imperfection or that. So you're right, it could actually make things much worse. What else is in play institutionally with this kind of agreement?
Like culture or like ethic concept, like consideration, like ethical stuff, like, if we say like stakeholder, like how many stakeholder do we consider, and like how much like extent of like culture or do we like, consider into this agreement or consortium?
So Amy, if I'm hearing you, that it's almost creating an artificial culture that is one step removed from reality. And what does that do to reality? That's a very interesting question. How long do we tell people?
5 minutes.
Are we there?
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't you tell them that in 1 minute, we'll be bringing them back. I'm interested to hear what comes from that.
I'm not sure how this fits in properly, but it increases the divide of who has power.
Yes. Yes, because now the power to control these images is a new form of power.
Because people might get compensated for their image being used, but they don't get a voice in terms of how their image
Exactly.
get altered.
Exactly.
So, there's, again, to this sort of payment system, you've taken out the voice and
Yes.
you sort of controlling. I mean, every one of us, we choose what we're wearing, what we do, et cetera. But, here you have a technology that's able to decide what you're going to actually look like.
Yeah, they may show your digitally created image doing things that you would never do or never agree to.
Exactly.
But
And so you could imagine, and to the core of what you're saying, with any new technology, the ability to shape it is greater early on than later on. So in 1990s, if we had known about weaponized social media, we would have done some things differently than what we're now dealing with. So if we had said, and they didn't, obviously, it was a negotiations that was a difficult one, but if they had said that you have a say in how your image is used, it would set in motion an entirely different path forward. And one in which there's now a co-creation with the technology. People use the phrase, are you racing with the machine or against the machine? And that would have been an inspirational move in society.
That was not in the SAG-AFTRA agreement.
I don't know the details on the ground. It's very possible they raised it and this was a compromise that was the best they could do. It was a difficult strike. But
Because that rhetoric was used in the strike, people
Yeah.
were saying, I want to have control over my body.
yes,
So, that was explicit.
Yeah. so in that sense, I don't know how to say this except directly, the studios made a more narrow self-interest stance on this when they could have done something that was more transformational. And I don't know if they even were able to see it that way. Yes.
well, one quick thing, I think we are simply in a transitional space at this point in time. We still take images of people and modify them. Who needs the people? When we start going further, You create your own people, you don't need the people, you don't.
Right, well,
you
and-
don't- and so the whole thing becomes totally irrelevant.
Yeah.
And that's my concern, you know.
Yeah, no, you know, in some sense, we're already traveling down that road, that alterations of images and what have you is in play. But the larger thing is that as more and more of this becomes artificially created, it really does create this deeper divide in reality about what's real and what's not. And that's why the People magazine is not just a humorous comment, it's a whole, you know, part of what it means to have folks who are held up as, for good or for bad, as you know, social leaders that now, you know, what happens to that? Ezra, do we have people online back?
Yes. Yeah, so 30 seconds.
Okay, so those of you who are online, if you want to just raise a hand and we'll be, Ezra will tell me if you're
Yeah.
there.
After 20 seconds, they will all join.
Okay, oh, not yet there. Okay, because what we'll do is we'll just take a few minutes of report out and then we'll go into our last piece. But as you can see, one small technological change, we've just begun to unpack the many dimensions to it. And with those of you who are now back, what I'd like to say is, first of all, welcome back. And secondly, if you could, use the holding your hand up so we can call on you. If a couple of you would share anything that came up in your discussions that you would like to share, please do so. And just to tee it up, here in the room, we were having a conversation as well, in which we really talked about how this is raising fundamental issues about how actors even have a say in the alterations that are done with them. It's not just compensation, but it's also voice. There were other things that came up as well, but I see, Chris, you have a hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Joel, and thanks for the opportunity to listen in on your talk today. It's very, very interesting. In our group, we maybe took the prompt a little too far, but one of the questions we started to noodle on a little bit was who speaks for the AI? In other words, at some point, if the AI has agency, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just throw that out.
So it is a real question that it is conceivable that at some point some of you are familiar with the book The Singularity, which argues that it's around 2045 that we cross that line.
Sooner.
So as it happens, Susan and I live just around the corner from Ray Kurzweil, the author of that book, and our kids carpooled to school together. And we get together probably once a year. And each time we do, I ask Ray, he has about 100 indicators that, you know, Moore's Law is just one of them that led him to that projection. And I said, well, how are we doing on the 100 indicators? And he said, we're on or ahead of schedule on all of them. And so Chris, your comment, you know, we will have to wrestle with that. And by the way, people will argue that we shouldn't treat animals as inanimate objects, that to varying degrees, they have identity as well, and presumably rights. Go ahead, Daniela.
Hello. I'm going to share a few notes that I had with my group, and then Mary or Tom, if you want to add any additional points. I know you guys were saying some really incredible things. So we talked about this expectation of negotiation. We had another case brought up in the group that we tried to think about, as well as with the Actors Guild, and so making sure that there's constant conversation happening and that people can decide kind of how things are going. We also talked about this aspect of time. I know you touched on it a little bit, but that they can come back and look for different permissions. They can have, again, that conversation aspect. And when we're making decisions and like writing things down, we keep a global context. when we talked about like having actors across the world and making sure there was equitable practices happening. We talked about EU and kind of their practices with AI and digital privacy. And so that kind of touched on a few of those things. And we also talked about, in the aspect of a global context, translating intellectual property and things like that in different languages. And I don't know if my group wants to add a little bit more about that, but those were some of the points that we brought up in our discussion.
So Daniela, thank you for sharing, and those are all great points. One of the important things that I heard that relates to a conversation here was that it will take regular conversations, as you said, between the actors and the producers and others. One of the things that was observed in this room is, how will you know that if an image is sent out and the actor has certain rights, will they even know that it's in another film or not? So the monitoring and the enforcement issues are real. But as you pointed out, those continuing conversations, the very nature of institutions is, if they're in-depth, productive, and meaningful, it will be creating one kind of set of institutional arrangements. If they're superficial and periodic, it'll take us down a very different institutional path. So thank you for talking about how this comes to life on the ground. Shaimal.
Thank you, Joel. I have a couple of things to share. One is, I don't completely agree with Chris about who speaks for AI, because the creators of AI are human. And so that's one thing, and there's a lot we can debate.
No, I appreciate that. And people talk about the human in the loop, that AI doesn't come out of thin air. And so the question is, what are both the rights and the responsibilities of the programmers that are developing the AI? And the key point about that is that there's unfortunately a long history of technological development in which potential stakeholders, and when I use the word stakeholder, by the way, the language of stakeholders is crucial when you're comparing shareholders in industry to stakeholders, but it also has some post-colonial, colonial kinds of connotations of putting a stake in the ground for ground that may not be yours. So people sometimes talk about rights holders different than stakeholders, such as First Nations. And people even talk about nature as a stakeholder. And I was at a conference a number of years ago in Sweden, where I met a woman whose sole job it was to create seats on boards of directors for future generations. And so unborn generations are a stakeholder in these conversations. But what I hear you saying is that the folks who are doing the programming are a stakeholder, but where does their voice come in, and what influence do we have over that? The history of technology is technologists create the technology, and other parties aren't in the conversation until after the fact.
And yes, and from our breakout group, I was with Ron Hutchins, and we were talking about the SAG agreement. And my thought was that related to synthetic performance or any other creation that happens, nothing is original, really. And so I believe that the consent and compensation perhaps is a fair and legitimate consideration to include in the agreement.
Thank you for that. Although, again, here in this room, we did argue figuring out what constitutes consent and what compensation level we're talking about is complicated. Bob McCursey, I saw you had a hand up.
Yes, Joel, most of the points have already been covered, but I think it's interesting to talk about the context because it's a fast-moving technology, and it may also be moving beyond the United States. So those two factors have to be taken into account. And then we get to the whole question about who resolves the disputes over the interpretation of the rules. So the rules themselves are going to have to change, have to be updated, what we used to call a living document, but that you still need some process by which disputes get resolved.
So that's a really important point. At one level, there could be you're speaking as an arbitrator, I know, arbitration on this agreement. But what if a producer in China takes the image and digitally or organizes it? You're raising the issue, who oversees that? And so you're right, this very quickly becomes a multinational challenge that's well beyond the four corners of a collective bargaining agreement.
Al's gonna answer.
So you couldn't hear it in the room, but Hal, the computer from how long ago?
2001.
Yeah, 2001. But actually, the film was created before that. So 68, yeah. And so maybe we need AI to enforce AI.
Yeah.
Well, let me stop there. I just wanted to get the dialogue going to sort of wrestle with these ideas. Ezra, let's put the slides back up. And I just want to take you through 1 second case example, and then we'll wrap things up. So the second case example, I said that the discussions of AI were fairly intense, some of it lightning rod, but the climate geoengineering project that I'm about to describe you was times 10. And just to give you some context, when we talk about climate geoengineering, we're talking about the intentional manipulation of the climate to counteract global climate change. And just to give you a flavor for this, about a year ago, while we were doing this project, as scientists decided to seed the clouds over the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and see what happens. And the Mexican government had not approved this, and they freaked out and immediately banned all climate alteration over Mexico. But the range of things that we call geoengineering include what's called SRM, or solar radiation management. And I'll just give you a taste on the space base. We had in some of the workshops, a group of a German company had millions of dollars of funding, and they said they were planning to launch into the atmosphere an array of satellites that would successfully block 2% of the sun's rays to the planet. They just weren't sure which parts would be affected when. What could go wrong? But there are folks doing space-based projects, doing atmosphere projects, doing land-based projects and ocean-based projects. There's folks doing direct CDR, carbon dioxide removal, both with these big filters that can filter things, as well as with biomass and various other means. And then there's things in the polar ice caps with afforestation, ocean restoration. So the range of ways that humans are intentionally manipulating the planet to prevent climate change, because the simple point is that the voluntary reductions against the UN standards are not happening as fast as we need. And so all of this stuff is on the table. What's interesting is 10 years ago, I was reading an article on this in which somebody said, this is not even on the table for discussion, it's a non-issue. Well, in a very short time, this has become a big issue. And we did a survey of mostly subject matter experts. These were either researchers who were not doing research in this area, but were knowledgeable, or who were doing direct research on this, as well as some industry folks. There were a few other people that responded, but the majority of the folks, this case where you had to actually pick a category, we didn't let you pick more than one. I would call this a set of industry experts. In fact, the focus groups, many of whom were respondents also to the survey, were some of the best of the world leaders in this area. So what did they say? I'm going to start with the fact that and this is not even all of the competing and contending comments. One person said we need to work towards a culture of trust, education, consistency, and monitoring with geoengineering. Great. Another said the sink's overflowing, it's flooding the room. We have to turn off the tap before we mop up the floor. And so we should be doing carbon reductions before we do anything about geoengineering. People said we have to worry about scientists just parachuting in and testing this with vulnerable nations in harm's way. People said it's unrealistic to expect this to be perfect, but it has to be perfect. People said what worries me most is that the commercial sector is moving ahead faster than anybody else, and it's leading to the profits for few at the expense of many. Somebody said, don't worry, the earth will survive, just we won't. And finally, it's very hard to get everyone to agree. And this is just, the conversations were intense on this. And just to give you, again, a flavor with the Z flowers, we asked people, is it important to ensure that climate interventions are not a substitute for emission reductions? That's the threshold thing. People said, don't go ahead and even think about this until you're already making progress on that. Virtually everyone agreed. In fact, it strikes me as odd that even somebody would say no, but it's possible that they were folks who said we shouldn't be doing this at all, because we had quite a few folks who said, don't do this. On the other hand, we said, how difficult is it? What strikes me is it's, I wouldn't call it bimodal in the sense of even two different even-sized groups, but there's a very large group that says this is very hard, and then another group that say it's not hard at all. And that worries me, that the not hard at all might be hubris, that we can do this, trust us. But at any rate, going into this, you go into it knowing immediately that there's a divide on how easy or hard this is going to be. The next one is a set of 3 Z flowers that strikes me as a fascinating pattern. Here's the pattern. When we started talking about this in the focus groups, people said, of course, we need ethical standards for any large-scale outdoor climate interventions. Of course, they said it's really hard to do, but the folks said, but you don't need to do anything different for the modeling and the lab studies that we're doing, because we have ethical standards for lab research. And so if you look at this, 98% said we need standards for large-scale interventions, 85% said we need it for small-scale interventions, but now we've got this bimodal splits in which some people say we need it for the lab studies and others say absolutely not. So there's a deep divide. And by the way, the easiest thing to do is to have ethical standards for lab studies. It gets progressively harder. And here's the thing that really worries me, which is if you start the ethics conversation in the lab upstream and in the modeling, it's easier to continue it as you go to small scale and large scale interventions. It's harder to come back to those issues when you're already moving into actual field applications. And so what we have is a place where people will accept an ethical climate regime for big changes, but they're not willing to go there for the small changes, but the small changes presage the big changes. And so there's a real dilemma here in terms of how you navigate this space. And the last thing that I'll say about this is that we asked people, and this at least is the issue you raised, how do we monitor compliance even when there isn't voluntary compliance? You can picture certain nations, North Korea and China, saying, we're not part of this regime. You can picture commercial enterprises saying, we're not part of this. And I've asked at the American Geoscience Convention, my hobby was to ask people, how would we monitor? And they said, well, for solar radiation management, if you saw certain patterns of flights going up and down to the atmosphere while seeding clouds, you could perhaps detect that something's going on. If you saw certain things happening in the oceans, you might be able to see them. But people really struggled to say, how would you even know if someone was doing this until after the fact? And so, again, people said it's really important and really, really difficult to do. And so this is, in a sense, an all hands on deck challenge for science, and even more broadly than that. And it has to be what we might call the global south as well as the global north. So just to wrap up, and by the way, this is the image from the Stanford Social Innovation Review article we did on Agile Consortia. And it really is this notion of folks doing together what they couldn't do separately. But to wrap up, what I'd like to do is come back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. With this research group, the Stakeholder Alignment Collaborative that we've had going for about 10 years, we've got a book coming out. This is an unpaid promotional announcement with Oxford University Press called the Consortia Century. And we argue that the challenges that we face as a society exceed the capacity of any organization or even institutional actor. It will take multi-stakeholder consortia to go forward. And just to give you a tiny example, one of the cases that we cite in the book is Takata Pharmaceuticals, which 7 years ago, they became a member of the first public-private partnership, multi-stakeholder kind of initiative. And in less than a decade, there are now members of 100 different multi-stakeholder consortia on different aspects of drug development, drug discovery, and what have you. And we've been counting consortia on the open sharing of data in science, and we see about 15 or 20 that were formed between 1950, actually a little more than 20, and 2000, and over 100 in the 20 years since. So exponential increases in folks stepping out of their institutional boundaries, many of which of these consortia are formed by institutional actors, but they're embedded in institutions that can't be as fast moving as a consortium. And so I believe the challenge for social policy, for organizational effectiveness, and really for surviving as a planet depends on new institutional arrangements that can be agile and adaptive in response to or in co-evolving with accelerating technological change. And in particular, these multi-stakeholder arrangements, we believe, will become a defining feature of the 21st century because the challenges can't be addressed in any other way. Thank you very much.
Time for a few questions.
So we have a little bit of time. I do want to promise to deliver to end on time or even early.
Okay. And at the same time, thank you very much.
I'm very, very good flower. So this is real. But mindful of time, but still, either those of you online or those of you here, any questions or comments? Yes, Maria.
Profound overview of the description of the problem and the stakeholders and their varying perspectives. So it really makes me lean in and wonder, how do you come up with the next action? How do you come up with the solutions? How do you move those stakeholders whom you've demonstrated in your Oxford Upcoming Press need to come together in a coalition? How do you go to the next step?
So I'm going to answer it in two ways. It's a great question. First, I first got involved in this multi-stakeholder work. My training was all in industrial relations, and I had a long history of helping to facilitate union management partnerships, and even economic development regional consortia, what were called area labor management committees. But in 2002, I was invited to be part of a project on aircraft noise and emissions. I did not know a lot about noise and emissions, but I knew a lot about stakeholders. And so we visited about 30 different actors, small airports, big airports, airlines, communities, federal agencies, and talked to the different stakeholder types. And we then, based on that, wrote what we thought would be a consensus report and sent it back to them. And we got hundreds of comments, not this, not that. And we convened them in a summit session. And at first people were saying, you can't do this, what about this? But about halfway through, I observed something which looked an awful lot like collective bargaining. Somebody said, well, we could do this with our engines, but we need to have this kind of new ways of doing steep descent to airports. And someone said, well, we could do that if you did this. And after this intensive back and forth, a true consensus report went back to Congress. And even today, 2 decades later, the Next Generation Air Transportation Initiative is moving forward on these various dimensions. So that was the first clue. What we've done since, and I've helped to facilitate many consortia, there's a concept in the literature called a boundary object, that certain objects sit at the boundary between two different parties and become a discussion point. And so when we do these stakeholder maps and do these Z-flowers and the visualizations, when you put them in front of folks, they start talking across the boundary. It's not that they didn't know these things, but it opens up the conversation. So, so what happens often is people have situational awareness of the landscape. They think they're in agreement, but when they see it, they say, oh, we can move forward on this. Or they think that everyone thinks like I do, and they realize they don't, and they realize discussion is needed. So when that happens, then three things happen following. One is out of that emerges elements of what we call a shared vision. And usually there's some facilitating work documenting what are all the elements of what could be a shared vision, a process by which you then distill it down, pass it around, and eventually it gets supported. Second thing that happens is some form of chartering. And what amazes me is if you want to form a for-profit, a nonprofit, or a government agency, there's all sorts of lawyers involved, steps in the process, and what have you. If you want to form a consortium, you announce a shared vision, you write a charter, and you exist. I mean, in Europe, by the way, certain social organizations do have to register, but we don't even have to do that here. And so the ability to form a multi-stakeholder consortia truly depends on a vision that people are drawn to and a charter that they say, I'm willing to live under it. They're always called living documents because for MSCC, which I mentioned, that charter has gone through 7 revisions in 5 years because they keep either seeing opportunities that they want to codify or tripping over things. One member of the leadership group left their CIO role in one HBCU and went to a non-HBCU college, but still wanted to serve on the board. And so that wasn't in the charter. So we had to say, well, how do we deal with that? And so there is a living chartering process in which you're really creating the institutional rules under which you live. And then the last piece is that there's this interesting process by which something moves from an informal group of people working together to something that has funding, that has staff, that is being institutionalized. And that's that structuration. You know, it becomes not just an emerging thing, but here's how we do it. And so that's the part that I get very excited about because you are literally changing the rules of the game and the institutions in which you live while you're living in them.
Thank you, Joel. You got more excited as you spoke more.
Yeah, there's a magic sense in the room that people suddenly realize that they have agency. They have agency to control their destiny. Shamal.
You perhaps alluded to what the response may be to my question, which is, what have you learned in practice with minimally viable consortia, the paper that was published, the big paper, the stakeholder?
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, the question is, has that model been put into practice?
Yeah, no.
What are
in the
the
article,
lessons?
we cite a number of examples that, in fact, have gone through this cycle that I've described. And, you know, the 100+ consortia that I mentioned in biomedicine, just in pharmaceuticals, by the way, there's many more in other parts of biotech. The 100+ in the sharing of data and science are just 2 very small ecosystems among many in which if you start counting consortia, you realize the numbers are bigger than we realize. Super. Any more comments or questions online? Go ahead, Annalisa.
Hi, Annalisa. I was a Heller alum, MPP MBA class of 2015. I know there's so much talk now about the impacts of AI on job structures and organizational structures, particularly I've seen within the private sector, given my scope of work where I've landed in tech. Given your private sector background, what are your thoughts on these impacts and particularly how we can support mitigating harm to our employees and potential employees that might be looking to join these companies?
So it's a great question. And the first thing is there is no guarantee of our success. But the more important thing that I would say is that the most important thing is having the forums for social dialogue. That if we're not talking about it, we'll be captive to it. But as we said, it's so important that those conversations happen further upstream. And we use the phrase racing with the machine rather than against it. And what's complicated is that there are some very strong competing interests for parties to act unilaterally that we're up against. I'll give you a tiny example. Early on, when people started talking about self-driving vehicles, I happened to know somebody in the strategy group at Intel. I knew somebody at senior levels of some of the auto companies, and I knew some government officials. And I said to all of them, shouldn't we be setting up a way of mitigating harm with the IoT data coming off of moving vehicles? Because the liability issues are massive. But at least if there was a common set of standards that everyone was agreeing to, it would reduce risk for everyone involved and possibly be better than everyone doing their own thing. Literally, everyone I talked to said, we want to be first and set the standard. And so the degree to which self-interest is at play in this is large. And the mechanisms to rise above that and identify how we proceed are crucial. The last example that I'll give you, I early on did a lot of work with something called the Biomarkers Consortium. And it was a product of 3 major pharma companies, each spending about $1 billion on a particular molecule, which they thought would be sort of a major advance in therapeutic medicine. And they all hit the same dead end around the same time and realized that if you tamper with this molecule, it would be catastrophic for human beings. But meanwhile, the opportunity cost of all of them spending all of this money, all of them doing the same research, was massive. And so they came to the NIH and to the FDA, and what they did is they carved out what they called a pre-competitive space. A biomarker is an indicator of health or disease. So glucose is a biomarker for diabetes. And they said, we will all pool resources to identify and qualify biomarkers. And then once we've done that, that will be open and shared. But then afterwards, people can develop their therapies or whatever they want to do. And so they created a common pool pre-competitive space for pharmaceuticals, biotech companies, FDA, NIH, patient advocacy organizations, and universities. And they've been going for 10 years. They've done a couple dozen projects, and it works. But I will tell you 2 things about it. One is some projects that are pre-competitive for pharma are competitive for biotech. And so project by project, people have to say, do you want to be in, which means open sharing, or do you want to not be in and have your own IP protected? And people choose. But the second thing is that it is a culture change in the industry, that people are now beginning to realize that this is a way to advance things that we wouldn't otherwise. And, it's playing a major role in a number of different therapeutic areas. It's a different way of operating. But this idea of a pre-competitive space is, I think, a very powerful concept. And there's lots of versions of that you can point to, but it's not something institutionally that we're used to even thinking about. So with that, I am mindful of time. Oh, Ali. So Ali is an alum from our school who actually worked at Takata and is now moved on to a new job, but who was actually working on these public-private partnerships. Go ahead, Ali.
Oh, thank you, Joel. Congratulations first. And I just have a question, and I hope you can answer it. I'm guessing you answered it before. Does the law of diminishing returns within the consortium come into play? And within a certain challenge, does also the law of diminishing returns occur? Having too many consortia would produce negative results? for a challenge. And inside the consortium, the bigger it is, at one point, it can create a negative return.
So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to speak on that from your own experience. But let me say that this guy, Ray Kurzweil, that I mentioned, argues that there's a law of expanding returns with some technologies, and that we're not always captive to the law of diminishing returns. Certainly, if you look at the story of Moore's Law, when he never called it Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, who founded Intel, wrote a small article in which it was called "How Many Transistors Can You Cram into a Circuit Board?" It's a great title. He was roundly criticized when he wrote that. One of the critics said, Gordon Moore is so crazy and off base. By the way, in the article, he predicted self-driving cars, wristwatches that would be able to communicate with others and tell you where you are. I mean, the things that he said in the article are exactly what's happened. But one of the critics tried to think of the most absurd implication of his argument, which was, next thing you know, Gordon Moore will be telling us that they're going to put computers and doorknobs in hotels. Well, of course, you can't check into a hotel without a card slot that's got a computer connected to it. But the point was that he took just a handful of observations about the circuits that you can cram onto a transistor doubling every 18 months. And he projected forward and came to these views. And so that is a case where the exponential rate of change has had accelerating returns to society. It's also had accelerating complications, but the digital revolution in computation is huge. By the way, that was preceded by the digital revolution in communications. And the book that I did with my brothers was the third digital revolution on digital fabrication, which is still in its early stages, but has exponential rates of growth attached to it. But at any rate, Ali, if you'll let me call back on you, what did you see? You mentioned both large and small consortia. Did you see cases where they hit diminishing returns or cases where they were sustainable?
Yeah, I think I saw both. I saw huge consortiums that were very productive, very agile, very effective. And I saw some consortiums that grew too big that had started not knowing like the accountability for certain topics within the consortium or certain tasks there. So I think there was no rule for either. So it was interesting to see both models happening at the same time.
And that really suggests that we have work to do, both to understand which ones were working well and which ones were hitting barriers of one kind or another. The science of this is still new. It's not that consortia are new, but really understanding them as an institutional arrangement, we're still early days.
Yes, I agree.
Super. Well, I really want to thank all of you. This has been a delight to share what frankly is my passion for something that's emerging in society and that I do think will be essential and perhaps definitional for the century ahead. Thank you very much.